be on time. So welcome everyone. I am Erin Stone. I am the history chair in the University of West Florida. I'm also a Latin American historian, so this panel I think is like the closest to my area that we have here, so it's pretty exciting. Thank you for coming this morning in this dark and cold room, but we have some really great papers. I will introduce each speaker before they present. I will provide a small comment at the end, and then we will open the floor to questions. So our first presenter is Dom Limley. He is a graduate student in history at the University of West Florida. He's actually about to graduate in December, so he is presenting on his capstone project. So take it away, Dom.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning. Dom Limley. She already introduced me, so that went that entire first line of what I was going to say. So I want to discuss the events surrounding the Columbus family in the early West Indies. Okay. The particular period that I'm talking about is the first 2 decades of the 16th century, which is often overlooked because everyone who is publishing anything wants their stuff to sell, so they're going to publish about Christopher Columbus most often. I wanted to see what happened after that. So I started doing a lot of research, and I've been working on this topic for probably about 6 months now. And I've kind of narrowed this down to really feeling like my research has centered on the political strife caused by Diego Columbus, the son of Christopher Columbus, with his struggle against the Spanish crown. Now, it seems kind of counterintuitive because he was representing Spain, but this whole period is very rife with dissension between the crown and the Columbus family. So for my thesis on this, I'm asserting that the strained political climate of the early Spanish West Indies is a result of Diego exercising absolute authority, like we know from the absolute monarchs, over the objections of the Spanish crown. Okay. The secondary material I have for this is actually very sparse. The family that came after Christopher Columbus is mostly known for their lawsuits in Spain over their hereditary titles. And it comes up in a lot of footnotes. It comes up time and again with the stories of this is what Columbus believed and this is why everyone else matters. But nobody directly addresses Diego frequently, I should say. You do find a little bit here and there, and I found one author who wrote a book about the Greater family that has quite a bit in there, but it's all significantly aged at this point. Most of it was written back in the 1960s or way before that in the early 20th century, around 1910. So that's what I'm contending with, and that's why I think that my research offers me an opportunity to really go further with this family. So on April 30th of 1492, Christopher Columbus convinced King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to grant him permission to sail westward in search of a sea route that would bring prosperity to Spain. The king and queen instructed the royal secretary to write out the capitulations of Santa Fe, which gave the hereditary titles to Christopher Columbus. If he was successful, he would receive the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the governor of anything he discovered, as well as the viceroy powers over all discoveries, which essentially granted him king-like status of anything he discovered. At the end of his 3rd voyage to the Caribbean, Christopher Columbus's reputation was pretty tarnished. All right, he had had uprisings. Thousands of natives have died underneath his watch, and they end up sending Francisco Bobadilla to take over the islands. And he arrives, he sees everything absolutely, just in utter chaos and upheaval, and he arrests Christopher Columbus and sends him back to Spain. This becomes the very beginning of the rivalry between the Servidors, or the loyalists who listen to the king's orders, and the Colombinistas who follow what Columbus and his family say instead. Okay? When he gets back to Spain, he starts petitioning immediately. He says, I've discovered this. I deserve to be in charge of everything. And eventually, the court does allow him to go back. Whenever they do, however, we have Nicholas de Ovando, who is also sent first to essentially take over where Bobadilla left off. And Christopher Columbus is given strict orders: do not even go to Hispaniola, avoid it entirely. That same fall that they get over there, a hurricane strikes the island and just absolutely devastates the capital. Now, the new governor, Ovando, he turns this setback into a time of opportunity. All right, he starts putting all the Servidors who came with him to work, ensuring that they have a good financial future ahead of them by making sure that they had access to all the resources that the Columbus family had not given the people who were there. And Governor Ovando wanted to make the island itself profitable because he wanted to ensure his future as well. So he's increasing the taxes on the people, but they're still loyalists. So they're like, okay, we can do this. He starts sending money back to the monarchs in Spain. And this creates a sense of loyalty back from Ferdinand and Isabella to Ovando. So they've got their guy in place now. And he's leading what they want. He's doing the job quite well at this point. Now, the increase in the taxes and an elimination of the implementation of the native enslavement system that we call the encomienda system was good for Ovando, but this also caused some contention back in Spain because Queen Isabella was not okay with this. She did not want the natives enslaved. She was giving orders that countermanded this. She says, this doesn't work. These are our people, just because they're natives, it doesn't work. She did eventually loosen up this decree because the people who were there were making their profits. They were doing well, and they demanded that this continue. So the official view was that the Spaniards that were in charge, called encomienderos, were entrusted with a number of natives under their care, and would not be considered slave masters, but would collect tribute in gold and labor from the specified group of natives they had. And in return, they had to provide food, shelter, education, and Christian principles and mores. And while it was legally not supposed to be slavery any longer, there was little difference between this and traditional chattel slavery. Governor Ovando began utilizing this encomienda system to reward and gain more loyalty from servidors who had once been loyal to the Columbus family. He also began reallocating enslaved natives from some of the encomiendas and moved them away to show where his favor specifically was being placed. This favoritism became a form of economic warfare, rewarding those who... tripping over my own words here because I'm trying to read my script and throw in what I know from all my research now. Essentially, if the fealty of a person was questionable, he was not receiving these benefits of the encomiendas that Ovando was distributing. And this was literally the make or break for a lot of these Spaniards who were coming over to Hispaniola. So the favoritism itself was a form of warfare between the Servidor faction and the Colombinistas that were coming as well. Now, during his final voyage to the Caribbean, Columbus discovered his ships were unseaworthy. They're leaking. He gets stranded on the shores of Jamaica for a year. And keep in mind, at this time, the Caribbean didn't have just fleets of ships sailing around. It was rare to see people, if you're stuck on an island somewhere. So this meant that they had a long wait for any kind of hope of a rescue. Now, eventually, Governor Ovando, he sends out a ship to find out what condition Columbus and his crew were in, but they did not rescue anybody. They literally were communicating with Columbus on the shore, but wouldn't even bring their ships up to the beach to get anybody, even Columbus himself. Now, the captain of that ship actually turned out to be a Columbanista, and he explained that Governor Ovando was delaying this rescue purposefully. He was hoping that Columbus would die. Now, of course, this reaches his son Diego, and this just like inflamed the animosity between these two groups. All right. Now, after his rescue, Columbus did finish his voyage in 1504, returned to Spain right after Queen Isabella had died. The Queen's death left King Ferdinand with an unruly aristocracy from Isabella's homeland of Castile, who did not support King Ferdinand's rulership of the United Spain. In an attempt to appease these nobles, Ferdinand abdicated his throne, favoring his daughter Juana that he had with Isabella and her husband Philip, and they took charge. Now, when Columbus gets back, he began petitioning the new rulers of Spain in regards to his claim of complete control over the West Indies, but Admiral Christopher Columbus died before that was ever recognized. That death of Columbus triggered the hereditary stipulations in the capitulations of Santa Fe, which instructed that Diego Columbus, his son, receive all those titles that his father was promised. Before Diego could enshrine the claims to this new law, King Philip died, the husband of Juana, and left Juana so grief-stricken she was unable to even rule the country at this point. And she stepped down, allowing her father Ferdinand to take over the throne again. The king's return was just absolutely marred with his paranoia of the feudal system. He was worried that all this aristocracy in Spain, these nobles, were secretly working against him. That's why he had to step down originally. And he's like, I'm back, but can I do this? Okay? Now, he particularly feared the Columbus family because the people of Castile were very, very loyal to the Columbanistas. Okay? So, with the West Indies, he began placing servitors in positions of power. Okay? He believed that with the demise of the admiral, now the crown would get all full control again over the West Indies, and they could start bringing in additional revenues because the Columbus family was no longer going to be collecting their own taxes. The king made multiple deals with the nobility of Spain, and through these deals, Ferdinand was able to secure his position, and the political price that came from this was a huge financial debt. Now, of course, he could pay some people off, but that wasn't going to be what everyone wanted. Other nobles wanted to trade their financial, the debt owed to them. They wanted to trade that for political favors. Now, Diego Columbus was serving in the courts of Spain, which likely led to a refinement of his charisma. He made good connections within the aristocracy and eventually marries into a noble family as well. So it's not too surprising that Duke of Alva wanted Diego Columbus appointed to the positions that were promised to his father. Now, that would seem like it goes directly against the plans of King Ferdinand. However, Ferdinand also had a request from Queen Isabella prior to her dying that Nicholas Ovando be removed from power in the West Indies because of his enslavement of natives. She wasn't happy with that. The Castilians, her people, were not happy with Ferdinand, so he goes, okay, I can make this work. All right, I'll appoint Diego, and Diego with all the Castilians will have power again, but it won't be a big of a struggle as it was with Columbus. Well, depending on the perspective, that may have been a good trade, but it turns out that Diego's force of personality was way more than Ferdinand had ever planned for. And when he went to the West Indies, he brought a huge retinue of Castilians with him to replenish all the ranks of the Columbanistas who had fallen out of favor under Ovando. Now, the king wanted to ensure that he still had some manner of control over Diego. So his solution was to send a servitor to become the first treasurer of the West Indies, and by doing so, he's created a check against the power that he worries that Diego might have because now this treasurer controls every aspect of the finances of Spain in the West Indies. Now, I really feel that the island of Puerto Rico is probably one of the best examples, so I've kind of focused on this for this part of my research to kind of show you the amount of conflict between these two factions within the same nation. So King Ferdinand contested the other powers and titles granted to the Columbus family other than that of admiral. This eventually results in the legal challenges that Diego began that I mentioned earlier, the Pleitos Colombianos, which are literally just the Columbus lawsuits. And there are just extensive amounts of history written about this. It's a great primary source on Diego himself. So he does that in 1508, prior to sailing to the West Indies. And while Diego is making his preparations to go to the West Indies, of course, word reaches Ovando that there's an upcoming change in governorship. Governor Ovando wanted to ensure that the king's interests were looked after because he was about to lose the power to do so himself. To that end, he had also recently received a request from Ponce de Leon, the explorer who had quite a bit of knowledge about gold being in Puerto Rico. And he wanted the right to acquire the riches for himself and, of course, the king. This meets Ovando's needs perfectly. So, the problem was Diego Columbus had a claim to this island as his father had originally found it. Now, Ovando put Ponce de Leon in charge of the island, even though that claim existed, and he stipulated that 2/3 of the gold found would all go to the king, and then the first third would go to Ponce de Leon. Now, the king knew of this deal and approved of it. All right. He also sent additional hidalgos, which are kind of an elite knight class within the Spanish time period there, that would help secure this wealth for Ponce de Leon. Now, the king was putting men in place whose loyalty to the crown would be guaranteed by granting them access to Puerto Rico's wealth. He believed that Puerto Rico would be the next big gold boom if it was exploited correctly. Ponce de Leon believed that he could make this work without using the encomienda system. Okay, he decided that he could do this mining work without displacing natives to a great degree or causing conflict, which had plagued the Spaniards in all their colonization attempts prior to that. Now, Diego protested in the courts back in Spain what the king had done. He believed that since his father discovered it and they had an agreement already in place, that his family should be the ones that control this land. And he also contacted two hidalgos who were loyal to the Colombanista faction and sent them over as well. Now, they brought several hundred miners. Okay, they took this small operation, which was, primary. Wow, that looks terrible on that. Okay, cool. That looks like okay, yeah. Well, it looks a lot better on my slide. But essentially, you have like this big mountain range right here, and up here in the north is where Ponce de Leon is kind of operating. Columbus sends all these hidalgos over, and they just start spreading everywhere. Okay, they're encroaching on all the territories that Ponce de Leon had respected previously, and then Columbus also says, look, you guys are all now encomienderos too. So you need to start putting these natives in encomiendas. You're going to control everything, do the Christian thing, and make sure that they're all educated, but let's also get some wealth, okay? This granted just absolutely enormous wealth to these people who previously did not have that same access. This reaches a point of, I refer to it as kind of a quasi-war between the Colombanistas and the Servidores at this point, because they're starting to arrest each other. They're having, open conflict. I don't have records of any actual deaths, so I don't believe it reached an armed warfare between the factions, but it was to the point where they were legally threatening each other at this juncture. So King Ferdinand also issued a secret order to his treasurer, which royally appointed Ponce de Leon the governor over Diego's protest, which further escalated these tensions in the region as well. When Ponce de Leon confronted the Colombanista Hidalgos, they refused to acknowledge the authority over what Diego had ordered them to do, even with the royal order from King Ferdinand. They're like, no, our guy's the viceroy. He has all the authority here. So the new Servidor governor, Ponce de Leon, placed the Colombanista Hidalgos under arrest and even caused one of them to resign openly from his position that Diego had appointed him. Now, of course, Diego, he's pretty much in the court system quite a bit at this time, immediately notifies his lawyers and launches a second legal battle against the king, resulting in the Audiencia, the court system in Spain, upholding Diego's claim to the island instead. Shortly after he arrived in Hispaniola, they ruled in favor of him in his other lawsuit, granting him the actual viceroy and governor powers over the West Indies broadly. Diego claimed that this gave him absolute authority, and he could act as though he were the king himself. So this already tense actions that we're having from either sides are now even further polarized, because Diego's essentially claiming that he is not quite the king, but his power is that of the king. He's got that same, that same level of power. So, lost my place. Good grief. The remaining Hidalgo that was still over there, he began to spread encomiendas even further, encroaching further on the Native Americans' territory, and this caused a armed conflict to happen with the natives over there, to which Ponce de Leon was actually leading the Spanish armies. After winning this war in favor of Spain, Ponce de Leon did leave the island, and he started sailing, doing more exploration, and eventually, am I down to 1 minute? Oh, Lord. And eventually makes it over to Florida. Let me jump past this part because she's getting me. Now, I know, I thought I trimmed this down enough. I did not. So, in 1520, Diego returned to the West Indies after going back and forth to Spain a few times, arguing with the king, arguing with the emperor who succeeded him. And he was trying to show that he did still have this power, and he was eventually granted it. However, his conflict with the crown had escalated so far that eventually Emperor Charles V, the grandson of King Ferdinand, said, this is it, no more. You're coming back and you're not allowed to be in charge of these islands any further. But at this point, the loyalist factions and the Colombanista factions were vying so much for power that the whole island took another 20 years to straighten out the legal systems again and reassert government authority over the locals. I think I fit that into that last minute.